Today, we're exploring the disturbing case of a young woman who arrived in the United States full of hope, believing she was about to start a new life through marriage. She had spoken to her future husband for months, trusted his promises, and left her family behind convinced she was safe. But just days after moving into his home, her contact with the outside world began to change. Messages grew shorter. Calls were avoided. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. What her family believed was a difficult adjustment period would later turn into a criminal investigation that uncovered deception, financial pressure, and a death hidden behind carefully written messages. This is the case of Avani Kulkarni, and it begins long before she ever set foot in America. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The introduction was arranged through distant relatives who presented the match as sensible and secure. There was no emphasis on romance. The focus was compatibility, stability, and migration logistics. Raghav Mehra was described as a U.S. citizen with permanent employment and a settled life in a suburban neighborhood. He lived alone and told intermediaries he was ready for marriage. Avani Kulkarni was living in Pune with her parents. She had completed her education and had no prior plans to move abroad until the proposal was presented to the family. Initial contact began through scheduled video calls. These conversations were structured and polite. Raghav spoke at length about his life in the United States, emphasizing predictability and routine. He described a modest but comfortable home, a steady income, and long-term intentions. He repeatedly used phrases like building something together and starting fresh. Avani listened more than she spoke. Family members were often nearby during early calls, observing. No conflicts were visible. Over time, communication became more frequent. Messages were exchanged daily. Raghav asked detailed questions about Avani's habits, her expectations, and her willingness to relocate permanently. He reassured her that adjustment would be gradual and that she would not be rushed. He presented himself as patient and emotionally available. Avani's parents later stated that she appeared relaxed during these calls and spoke positively about him afterward. She told them he was attentive and respectful. Practical discussions began during the engagement period. Raghav raised financial topics early. He disclosed that a small business he once attempted had failed and left him with debt. He framed this as a temporary setback. He said marriage would allow him to stabilize and move forward. These disclosures were positioned as honesty, not warning signs. Avani's parents were informed and did not object. The topic of dowry was introduced as support, not obligation. Avani's parents agreed to provide a significant amount after the wedding, consistent with family custom. There was no written agreement. Raghav acknowledged the arrangement and expressed gratitude. He referenced future expenses, immigration filing costs, and household needs. He often spoke about timing, explaining that delays could complicate plans. Despite this, his tone remained calm and reassuring. Throughout this period, Raghav emphasized trust. He told Avani that life in the U.S. required cooperation and mutual dependence, especially during the first months. He said he would handle paperwork and logistics so she could focus on adjusting. Avani accepted this framework. She had limited direct exposure to immigration processes and relied on his guidance. When Avani's K-1 visa was approved, preparations accelerated. Family farewell ceremonies were recorded. Avani appeared smiling and composed in these videos. She spoke about beginning a new chapter and reassured relatives she would stay in close contact. There was no indication of doubt or fear at that time. Travel arrangements were finalized by Raghav. He provided instructions for arrival and assured Avani he would be waiting at the airport. He reiterated that wedding planning would begin immediately after she settled. In messages sent days before departure, he referred again to financial pressure and the importance of keeping plans on schedule. These messages were not confrontational and did not raise concern. Avani left India believing the marriage was stable and the future predictable. The image she carried of Raghav was built entirely through controlled communication, mediated introductions, and promises that were never tested in shared physical space. The version of him she trusted had only existed through screens, messages, and assurances repeated often enough to feel real. Avani arrived in the United States in early spring. She entered on AK-1 visa carrying 2 suitcases and personal documents. Raghav met her at the airport alone. There were no friends or family present. Surveillance footage later confirmed a brief greeting. No visible affection was shown. He drove her directly to his house. The residence was located in a quiet suburban area. The interior did not match what Raghav had described during their calls. The space was smaller, minimally furnished, and lacked personal items typically associated with shared living. Avani did not have a designated area of her own. According to later witness statements, the house appeared temporary rather than prepared for a new arrival. During the first several days, neighbors observed Avani only in Raghav's presence. She was rarely seen outside alone. When she did appear, she walked a few steps behind him. No social interactions with neighbors were recorded. There were no visitors. Avani contacted her parents by landline and internet calls. These calls were regular but brief. She reported being tired, adjusting to time differences, and dealing with paperwork. Her tone was positive, though noticeably restrained. She did not speak at length. Her parents later stated that she seemed hurried and ended calls abruptly, often saying she would call back later. Within the first week, Raghav's behavior changed. Financial discussions became frequent and direct. He questioned Avani about daily expenses, even minor purchases. He began controlling when she could leave the house and asked to know who she spoke to. He insisted that immigration-related costs and household bills were increasing and needed to be addressed quickly. The dowry became a recurring topic. Raghav repeatedly asked when the transfer would be made. Avani explained that her father intended to send the money after the marriage ceremony, as previously agreed. This response led to visible frustration. According to digital records, Raghav searched repeatedly for information related to dowry transfers and timelines. Arguments began occurring inside the house. There were no reports to police at this stage, but later forensic analysis documented raised voices captured indirectly on a neighbor's home security system during late evening hours. These incidents increased in frequency. Avani began noticing inconsistencies. She found unpaid bills, past due notices, and collection letters addressed to Raghav. Some envelopes had not been opened. She confronted him about this. His explanations varied. At times he blamed past business partners. Other times he claimed delays were administrative. These explanations did not match what he had previously told her before her arrival. The tone of communication shifted. Messages from Raghav became directive rather than supportive. He monitored her phone usage and discouraged long calls with her family. He emphasized that too much outside involvement could complicate things. Avani later searched online for return flights to India using shared household internet. These searches were recovered during the investigation. Avani contacted her parents privately and asked if it was possible for her to return home early. She stated that Raghav was not the person she believed she was marrying. She did not describe physical violence at that point but expressed fear and regret. Her parents advised her to be patient and suggested that adjustment stress was common. They were not aware of Raghav's financial situation or his increasing pressure regarding money. Inside the house, control tightened further. Raghav tracked Avani's movements and questioned her about conversations. He repeated that the dowry was essential for stabilizing their future. The wedding date remained undefined, despite earlier assurances that it would be scheduled quickly. By the end of the first week, the relationship had shifted from planned partnership to conflict. Avani was isolated in an unfamiliar country, financially dependent, and increasingly aware that the circumstances she had entered were misrepresented. At the same time, Raghav recognized that the money he expected might not arrive on his timeline. The tension inside the house continued to build, with no external intervention and no clear resolution in sight. On the 11th day after her arrival, Avani told Raghav she wanted to return to India. She asked him to give her passport back and said the wedding would not happen. According to later reconstruction, this conversation took place in the evening, inside the house. It was the first time Avani clearly stated she was leaving. The argument escalated fast. Voices were raised. Objects inside the house were moved. There was no indication of planning or preparation earlier that day. Investigators later concluded the situation unfolded suddenly and emotionally. During the confrontation, Raghav pushed Avani. She lost her balance and fell backward, hitting her head against a hard surface near the floor. She stopped responding. Raghav did not call emergency services. Phone records later confirmed there was no call to 911, no call to a hospital, and no attempt to seek outside help. Instead, he stayed inside the house. He tried to wake her, then left her where she had fallen for a period of time. Medical experts later testified that the head injury alone did not immediately cause death. At some point after the fall, Avani was still alive but incapacitated. Autopsy findings later showed clear signs of pressure applied to her neck. The injuries were consistent with hands, not an object. The pressure was applied long enough to stop breathing. This occurred inside the house, shortly after the fall. Death was ruled a homicide. What followed was panic-driven decision-making. Raghav did not attempt to stage an accident or call for help. Instead, he focused on keeping the situation from being discovered. He dragged Avani's body from the living area toward the back of the house, away from windows and shared spaces. Later forensic work identified disturbance patterns on the floor consistent with this movement. He then attempted to clean. Cleaning supplies already in the house were used on the area where she fell. The effort was uneven. Some areas were wiped repeatedly, others barely touched. Investigators later recovered trace evidence despite the cleaning. That same night, Raghav accessed Avani's phone. He unlocked it using information he already had. He reviewed recent messages and contacts, then sent a short message to her parents. It said she was tired and adjusting and would talk later. The message avoided specifics. Over the next days, he continued using her phone and accounts. Messages were sent at irregular times, often late at night. He reused phrases Avani had used before. Requests from her parents to speak directly with her were avoided. Excuses included exhaustion, stress, and paperwork. At the same time, Raghav avoided actions that would draw attention. He did not report Avani missing. He did not contact immigration offices. He did not set a wedding date. When asked, messages blamed delays on administrative issues. Communication with Avani's father continued. The dowry was mentioned indirectly. Raghav referred to upcoming expenses and preparations, framing the transfer as something that would happen once things settled. Investigators later described this as an attempt to keep financial expectations alive while maintaining the appearance that Avani was still present. Digital analysis later showed that after the 11th day, Avani's phone showed no independent activity. There were no location changes, no outgoing calls, and no typing patterns consistent with her use. All activity came from the same limited location. From the outside, nothing looked urgent yet. Messages continued. There was no silence. No missing person report had been filed. Inside the house, however, Avani was already dead, and every action taken after that night was aimed at delaying discovery and controlling what her family believed was happening. For nearly 3 weeks after Avani's death, Raghav continued to present the situation as normal. Communication with her parents did not stop. Messages were sent regularly, though not daily. They were brief, written late at night or early morning. The wording closely matched Avani's previous style. Phrases were reused. Short explanations were offered for delays. He avoided anything that would require live interaction. Requests for phone or video calls were deflected. Raghav cited stress, exhaustion, and technical problems. He claimed the internet connection was unstable and that Avani was overwhelmed by paperwork. When her parents asked specific questions, responses were vague and delayed. The pattern was consistent, reassurance followed by distance. During this period, Raghav also took steps to remove physical evidence. Investigators later established that Avani's body was no longer inside the house within days of her death. Vehicle records and traffic camera data showed Raghav driving late at night on multiple occasions to areas outside his usual routine. These trips occurred after midnight and before sunrise. According to reconstruction, he transported Avani's body in his personal vehicle. The location chosen was remote, accessible by an unlit service road, and not associated with him socially or professionally. The site showed no signs of recent activity by others. The decision appeared opportunistic rather than carefully planned, based on familiarity with the area and lack of surveillance. Personal items belonging to Avani were disposed of separately over time. Her clothing, travel documents, and small belongings were not discarded together. Some items were later recovered in public trash receptacles several miles apart. Others were never found. This staggered disposal reduced the chance of immediate discovery. Back at the house, Raghav continued cleaning. Investigators later documented areas where furniture had been repositioned and flooring had been repeatedly wiped. Certain items Avani had brought from India were missing entirely. There were no signs she had packed voluntarily. Despite maintaining the illusion, communication with Avani's parents began to strain. Messages became less frequent. Excuses repeated. The family noticed that Avani no longer initiated contact. All communication was reactive. When calls went unanswered for extended periods, concern increased. Raghav continued indirect discussion of the dowry. He framed delays as administrative. He referred to immigration forms, scheduling issues, and the need for patience. He implied that once paperwork was resolved, the wedding could proceed. Investigators later described this as an effort to keep financial expectations active while delaying any irreversible action that would expose the situation. Eventually, Avani's parents contacted local authorities in the United States and requested a welfare check. They explained that their daughter had stopped communicating normally and that they were unable to reach her directly. This was the first time law enforcement became involved. When officers arrived at the house, Raghav answered the door alone. He told them Avani had returned to India after an argument. He claimed she left suddenly and did not want further contact. He provided no documentation to support this claim. Police checked airline and immigration records. There was no evidence Avani had left the country. No departure record existed after her arrival. This contradicted Raghav's statement immediately. Inside the house, officers observed signs that raised further questions. The space appeared recently cleaned beyond routine maintenance. Some personal items typically associated with a recent arrival were missing. There were no packed suitcases. No travel preparations were visible. Digital analysis followed. Investigators examined the devices used to communicate with Avani's parents. They determined that messages sent after her death originated from inside the house. There was no independent activity from Avani's phone or accounts. All interactions were controlled from a single location. As timelines were compared, inconsistencies became unavoidable. The dates of messages, the lack of travel records, and the physical condition of the house did not align with Raghav's explanation. The welfare check escalated into a full investigation. By the end of this period, the illusion Raghav had maintained began to collapse. What initially appeared as marital conflict and distance now showed clear signs of deception. The case shifted from a concern for welfare to a focused inquiry into Avani's disappearance and the actions taken to conceal it. After the welfare check, the investigation shifted from a missing person inquiry to an active search. Detectives began mapping Raghav's movements during the 3 weeks following Avani's last confirmed activity. Attention focused on nights when he left the house for extended periods. Vehicle data, toll records, and traffic cameras showed repeated late-night trips outside his normal routine. These trips followed a consistent pattern. Raghav left the house after midnight and returned before dawn. The routes did not correspond to work, shopping, or social activity. Analysts identified an isolated area accessible by a secondary road with limited lighting and no residential traffic. His vehicle appeared near that location on multiple nights shortly after Avani's death. Search teams were deployed to areas connected to those movements. Investigators prioritized locations that matched the timing and distance of the vehicle data. Within days, human remains were located in a remote area consistent with the reconstructed travel path. Identification confirmed the remains were Avani's. The recovery immediately shifted the case to homicide. The condition and placement of the body ruled out an accidental death or natural causes. The location showed no signs of third-party involvement. There was no evidence Avani had traveled there on her own. An autopsy was conducted. The medical examiner identified blunt force trauma to the head consistent with a fall against a hard surface. However, the cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Bruising and tissue damage on the neck showed sustained manual pressure. The sequence of injuries confirmed that Avani had been incapacitated before breathing was stopped. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Raghav was confronted with the findings. During multiple interviews, his account changed. He initially repeated the claim that Avani had returned to India. When that was disproven, he suggested she left voluntarily and cut off contact. After the body was recovered, he claimed the death was an accident. Each version contradicted physical and digital evidence. Financial records were introduced into the investigation. Raghav was found to be in significant debt. Bank statements showed overdrafts, overdue payments, and repeated inquiries related to international transfers. Investigators documented searches and messages related to dowry timelines and expected amounts. These records showed mounting financial pressure in the days leading up to Avani's death. Digital forensic analysis of Avani's phone uncovered draft messages that had never been sent. In those drafts, she expressed fear and uncertainty. She wrote about wanting to leave and feeling misled. These drafts were timestamped before her death and had not been accessed afterward, confirming they were written by Avani herself. Prosecutors used this material to establish motive. They argued that Avani's decision to leave threatened Raghav's expectation of receiving the promised dowry. With no wedding and no transfer, his financial situation would worsen. The confrontation occurred when control was lost. The prosecution did not argue that the killing was planned in advance. Instead, they framed it as a crime that began as a domestic argument and escalated under financial stress. What followed, however, was deliberate. The concealment, false messages, disposal of the body, and continued financial communication showed awareness of wrongdoing. The messages sent to Avani's parents became central evidence. Prosecutors demonstrated how those messages delayed discovery and preserved the illusion that Avani was alive. This delay allowed Raghav to dispose of evidence and attempt to maintain access to the promised money. The continued references to dowry after her death were presented as proof of intent to deceive. Investigators emphasized that Raghav's actions after the killing were not panic alone. They involved repeated decisions over an extended period. Each step reduced the chance of immediate detection. Each message reinforced a false narrative. By the end of the investigation phase, the case had a clear structure. The evidence showed a fatal confrontation driven by financial desperation, followed by sustained deception. The illusion Raghav created to keep control of the situation did not collapse immediately. It unraveled only when timelines, data, and physical evidence were aligned. The trial began after Raghav was formally charged with second-degree murder, concealment of a body, and obstruction related to false statements and digital impersonation. The court focused on reconstructing events from Avani's arrival through the weeks of deception that followed her death. Due to distance and visa restrictions, Avani's parents testified remotely. They described receiving regular messages they believed were written by their daughter. The tone felt familiar. The messages referenced stress, paperwork, and wedding delays. Her parents explained that these messages reassured them and delayed any request for police intervention. They believed Avani was alive but overwhelmed. By the time communication stopped entirely, weeks had passed. Digital forensic specialists testified next. They showed that all messages sent after Avani's last confirmed activity originated from devices inside Raghov's house. Experts explained how message timing, phrasing, and repetition matched Avani's earlier writing closely enough to avoid suspicion. They also demonstrated that there was no independent phone movement, no biometric unlocks, and no outgoing calls made by Avani after the 11th day. The communication was entirely controlled by Raghov. Financial analysts presented evidence of Raghov's economic condition. Bank records showed significant debt, missed payments, and repeated overdrafts. Investigators also introduced searches and communications related to dowry transfers and expected amounts. The court heard that Raghov's financial stability depended heavily on receiving the promised money. When Avani decided to leave and the wedding collapsed, that expectation ended. Prosecutors then walked the jury through the physical evidence. They reconstructed the argument, the fall, and the medical findings. The medical examiner testified that while Avani suffered blunt force trauma to the head, the cause of death was asphyxiation. Injuries to the neck showed sustained manual pressure applied while she was incapacitated. The examiner stated clearly that the death could not be explained as an accident. The prosecution emphasized what followed the killing. Raghov did not seek medical help. He removed the body, disposed of it in a remote area, and continued sending messages to Avani's parents. Prosecutors argued that these were not actions taken in confusion, but repeated decisions made over weeks to delay discovery and maintain control over the situation. The defense acknowledged the argument and the fall but argued that the death was accidental and driven by panic. They claimed Raghov did not intend to kill Avani and acted irrationally afterward. The court rejected this explanation. Expert testimony established that the fatal act was the manual compression of the neck, not the fall. The prolonged concealment further undermined the claim of panic. The judge instructed the jury to consider both the act itself and the conduct that followed. Jurors were told to assess whether Raghov's behavior demonstrated awareness of guilt. The false messages, disposal of the body, and financial communication with Avani's family were presented as evidence of deliberate deception. After deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts, including second-degree murder. The verdict confirmed that Avani's death occurred during a violent domestic confrontation and that Raghov's actions afterward met the legal standard for murder under state law. At sentencing, the judge addressed the severity of the case. The court cited the exploitation of Avani's immigration vulnerability, the length of time the crime was concealed, and the emotional harm caused to her family. The judge stated that the deception prolonged the family's suffering and delayed justice. Raghov was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The court clarified that parole eligibility did not guarantee release and that any future consideration would require a full review after the minimum term was served. Until then, Raghov would remain incarcerated. The case concluded with a clear legal outcome. What began as an arranged marriage supported by trust and distance ended with a confirmed homicide, a prolonged cover-up, and a life sentence. The record shows how financial pressure, isolation, and control escalated into fatal violence, and how the effort to maintain an illusion ultimately became the strongest evidence against the person who created it.